Good. We now have the opposition team here. If you could pass them the ballot and have them fill it in. Right. Thanks. Okay, speakers. Which motion did you decide upon? No. The voting? Yeah, MNC. Multinational cooperation after members elected local parliament. Second along those lines. Good. Both teams are agreed that is the motion you'll be debating. Yeah. I have. Okay. Unless there are any questions, then I would like to invite the first speaker. The first speaker from the proposition team to take the stage.
The problem with multinational corporations is that they are profit incentivized and do not cater for the long-term stability of the populace. This debate is about whether or not society should have an opinion on the people who dictate their resources, and we're going to justify this to you on two different arguments, right? Why society has the right to choose, and two levels under that, and second, why this election and board of directors correct the problem that's perpetuating within status quo. But let's first look at our mechanism and how we're actually going to go about this process. We think we're going to follow it the same way we follow normal voting processes, right? This means that anyone above the legal age will be able to be voted in. We'll have like a voting day campaigns and manifestos where individuals can choose who they want to represent them within these campaigns as a whole. But what do we mean when we talk about board of directors? We're talking about the higher ups who actually control the biggest decisions. We're going to have this exactly in half, right? That means if we have like 12 people, we're going to have like 6 people who are representative of our country as a whole. What's our burden coming from side government? Our burden is to prove to you why our policy caters for long-term development of the country via the choice of the populace, and a stance that people should be able to choose what happens to their resources as a whole. Before I move on to my points, a little bit of background, right? What's actually happening within status quo, and why do we think this policy is a necessity? We think multinational corporations exploit these resources without accountability and do not cater for the long term of this country, right? They do not share the information that they gather, and they take a lot of our resources, oftentimes without giving it back, right? We think especially in developing nations, resources are the only way or the most important and best way for them to actually be able to develop, right? And a lot of times when multinational corporations take this away, it hinders the development of the nation as a whole, and society doesn't get to see whether or not these resources to be extorted in the way in which it's currently being extorted. Thirdly, when will our policy actually be the most effective, right? We think when decisions come at the expense of harming the country, this is when our policy will function as a safety net against exploitation by the multinational corporations. This means that the multinational corporations aren't harming our country. We don't think that's part of the debate. Let's look at my first extension on why safety has the right, why society has the right to choose, right? First of all, what's the harm of multinational corporations? We think multinational corporations are profit incentivized. This means that they don't care very much about the country, and they don't care very much about the populace, and they often make decisions that better include their income at the expense of harming other individuals and other members of society. But if these people are the ones who extract our resources and do whatever they want with it, we think in this instance, when we give it towards them in itself, right, and give our resources towards them, they extract it oftentimes selfishly, and they don't. MNCs extract all, we can't exactly get the all back, right? And even if they want to argue that the country the MNCs will redistribute that towards the country, we think this is conditional in itself, right? Because this also means that if there's higher demand elsewhere, that means that they're going to shift that demand outside of the country, and the country will be deprived of their own resources in itself. The conclusion to this first level is that multinational corporations will take advantage of countries if they benefit more. What's the second level coming from side government? We think why society is directly affected by these policies as a whole. First up level, we think the fact of the matter is that oil in itself is the only option a lot of times, or these kind of resources are a lot of times the only option that developing countries have to achieve a kind of developed status within status quo, right? And a lot of countries actually need to develop to be able to compete competitively in the international market as a whole. We think why these resources are exactly a necessity. Hold on, Sid. We think there are special and limited kind of resources is very competitive within the market as a whole. And once multinational corporations take these kind of resources, to prevent them from developing as a whole. We think on the first harm, MNCs have a vested interest in keeping those countries underdeveloped in the first place, right? Because this means that the countries will have a vested interest in calling the multinational corporations back to keep extracting their resources so that they don't have the ability to do it themselves. We think it's a harm that prevents them from being developed. But second harm, we think that we concede that multinational corporations may pay taxes and they may give some jobs. We don't think that necessarily matters on a comparative, right? Because we factor out the sense that you're paying, it creates a facade of the fact that these companies are paying back towards your people, and you don't ever take affirmative action in getting the kind of benefits that you need back as a whole, and we think this is a harm. On the third harm, we think this lengthens the time that it takes for these countries to develop and reach a standard in which they'll be able to compete competitively as a whole. We think society is directly affected. Go sit.
Given that companies often need profit to give back quality products, if you concede that society is self-serving, will they make decisions that's reflective of the needs of everyone or themselves?
Here's the problem, right? Multinational corporations are self-serving in itself. That means they only cater for the multinational corporations. When we have a board of directors, we'll have a check and balance at least, right? That means that we'll have an opinion that says that, okay, the company wants this, and we'll also have board of directors that gets a check and balance for that as a whole. We think at least our policy is still beneficial in that sense, right? Second argument, why does election and board of directions curbs the problem as a whole? We think it's safe to assume that society would choose someone who's the most legitimate, the most accountable, and the most representative of their beliefs and their interests in terms of keeping themselves as a whole. It's the same thing as what happens when you elect your prime minister or someone who represents your country as a whole, right? We think these people represent half of the board, so they're not exactly outnumbered by these people, and they're not outnumbering them as a whole. We think the importance of this is they balance to keep the company policy and the nation's interest as a whole. Exactly what I explained to Sid in my POI, right? So the same company procedure applies, right? So what do we mean by this exactly? It means when the company decides to do a policy or pass a policy, we allow for these individuals to have a say in what kind of policies actually happen. This means they can say yes or they can say no, and they can make amendments to this policy. There are two benefits that derive from this. First, policies get changed to benefit people. Sit down. At the what kind of policies are we talking about? Things like how much oil we get back, whether or not we're going to have a native tribe that's territory is going to be extracted by oil, and we'll have no check and balance towards this at all. We think at the very least, second benefit, they know they need to take actions for the people as a whole, that even if they don't amend these policies, at least they know that they have to counter and factor in the people before making a decision as a whole, because it's a mutually exclusive benefit on the outside. On the third level, we don't think corporations will opt out just because of this to begin with, for three separate reasons. First, we think they already have bases there, right, in these countries, in these developing nations as a whole. Second, we think resources in this instance, they need it more than anything. These multinational companies function off of these resources, and we think that they're more than willing to make this trade-off and adopt this policy in exchange for getting the amount of resources that we're willing to give with them. But third, we think they're still getting resources anyway, right? They're still going to have their bases there. Even if they don't have bases, they're still going to get at least 50% of the profit from these countries as a whole. But second, since they still have bases there, assuming they actually have bases and they adopt this policy, they don't need to build again, and they still get a sense of profit as a whole. We think the benefit of this policy is that at the very least, right, these countries are able to have a sense of check and balance. They're able to have a form of long-term sustainability towards these countries and these populace as a whole. We think on a comparative, underside opposition's paradigm, right, they'll never be able to factor in the needs of the people. They'll never be able to factor in the benefits of these people. The problem that's perpetuating within status quo will continue on where we have a monopoly of a multinational corporation, and we'll never be able to break that monopoly, and we'll never be able to cater towards the needs of the people as a whole. Side government wants to protect individuals on the ground, want to allow individuals to have a say in where their resources go.
The truth is, in developing countries, we need companies as much as they need us. In status quo, there is a balance of power, and they create an asymmetry of power, which is only conditional upon the people. Companies rely upon consumer power, and this debate extends to more than resources, to average consumer products that individuals purchase. Companies rely on consumer power to regulate their prices in status quo and regulate abuses that companies can do. Because if companies are too abusive, individuals will challenge corporations, and corporations lose profit. On the other hand of the symmetry of power, people also rely on corporations, because corporations make profit off of individuals, and it is a balance of power which keeps both sides happy. We don't want to create an asymmetry of power which favors individuals, because at the end of the day, corporations have no incentive to stay when they're being victimized. 2 points of rebuttal. Are they being exploitative? And secondly, will corporations opt out? Are they being exploitative? We agree. To some extent that they are exploitative. We can regulate these harms under status quo through political will to ensure that we can come to a base ground when it benefits both individuals as well as corporations. They are completely outweigh this harm. The truth is, even politicians opt for corporations under most circumstances. If we can change the political will of politicians in status quo, we can also regulate the abuses that companies have. But if politicians also opt for companies, we don't see how your harm is made any better. But secondly, it's more than just resources. It goes to also consumer products, things that people purchase and buy. And even if these things are exploited, we can regulate those harms. It is a lie to say that when companies sell products at a high price, people will buy them. It is a lie to say companies can increase those prices and people don't have a say when it comes to these circumstances. But even if the context of side government that is convenient is resources, we would prefer companies distributing resources than local governments distributing resources, considering that they are multinational, they have deeper reaches into benefiting and profiting off these resources, and we can tax them back for those benefits. If it were true that governments were better in distribution, we would have nationalized those resources to begin with. We would have distributed it upon a government state and a government standard. Governments in developing countries simply cannot do that. That is why we let developing countries do it, and we give them the autonomy to do so. So given that corporations are the best alternative that we have, we can minimize those harms by increasing political will, but your alternative, them leaving, is far worse. No, thank you. Secondly, will corporations opt out? They say they have bases. Burger King opted out of Canada because they are imposed on with higher taxes. Even with all the bases that they had on ground, at the end of the day, if they're compromised on profits, they can't build any more bases. If they're compromised on profits, they can't build any more buildings to sell their services. So it's a lie to say that bases keep them at bay. But even if resources exist in specific countries, they will go to other countries, Mr. Speaker, other countries that are more negotiable, other countries that are more comply towards their policies. So best case, some companies stay, and when some companies stay, that is when you have a true monopoly of power, because these are companies that are less effective. 3 questions of argumentation before I move on. Sure.
Here's the difference between McDonald's and oil. The difference is that you choose where you want to set up at McDonald's, but oils of which is only specific countries or we truly have a limited choice to choose.
Yes, but they are both multinational corporations, so stop arguing the wrong debate. We argue for both oil and McDonald's. Please expand your context to adjust to the debate. But even if that was true, even if we favor the McDonald's side, I've already proven to you, even resources are limited, a government distribution is much worse. 3 points of questions. 1, why are there higher barriers for MNCs to come in? Secondly, why corporations would leave and why is that harmful? And thirdly, why is corruption easier to regulate when corporations decide their board of directors instead of individuals? First question, why are higher barriers for MNCs harmful towards these individuals? We think that we need FDIs and MNCs more than they need individuals on the ground. Why would they leave? We think that board of directors have a high stake of power to hire and fire CEOs, to reject long-term policies that could decide the future of corporations. Corporations want to have this autonomy. We think giving citizens the autonomy is harmful to corporations because if they have a 50% stake, they can affect the policies on the ground. And they're not beneficial to corporations because the policies that come out are consumer friendly. What does this mean? Forcing corporations to subsidize your products, forcing corporations to have a higher variety in the products that they distribute. And all these things don't necessarily favor corporations at the end of the day. Because if it did favor a corporation, they would have done it to begin with. So what's the conclusion to this first level? We think that consumer confidence is bad for a number of reasons. We have a balance in status quo that favors both consumers because they have that power, that also favors corporations because they can make a profit. But why is it harmful that corporations lose a profit in status quo? When you pressure them into changing their policies, into reducing the profit that they can make, it stretches them. They reduce the quality of the products that they release and output onto the ground. That means tables and chairs that companies produce will reduce in price, but will also reduce in quality because they don't want to lose the same benefits that they already opted out with originally. But it's also worse for the economy because if corporations make less money, then you tax them less. When corporations make less profits, it's harder for the state to get back from corporations. So when individuals pay more for their services, we also benefit the economy. Second argument, why does all this result in corporations leaving? When corporations are imposed on, they are more likely to leave. Parallel to the Burger King example, they are more likely to leave in developing countries because they have a higher stake, they have a higher benefit in developing countries. So they're more reluctant to leave from a developed country country because they can't gain much from it, but they go into developing countries assuming that they'll make more because they can have higher probabilities that favor themselves. So they can charge higher in developing economies and developing countries because that's how corporations perceive it. Because at the end of the day, they make more profit. We think that when companies leave, and they will because they're compromised, three outcomes. One, you lose the jobs, the social structures and the temporary structures that were there. Individuals become jobless, and this is much more harmful than the corruption that they talk about. They take away skill sets that more often than not provide experience to individuals to go to higher level jobs on an international scale. But thirdly, the market loses diversity and also dies. Only the companies that stay in your economy are companies that can't afford to leave, and these companies get an asymmetry of power, and they monopolize your resources, they monopolize the products, and you can't challenge them because there's no other company to compete with. People have to buy from one area. Secondly, why is corruption harder to regulate? If someone is biased in status quo or someone is bribed in a company, we can detect it and we can fire a person on the ground. But that is different when people are elected, because when people are elected and people are accused of being bribed or corrupted, it's harder to oust them. It's harder to get them out of the board of directors because they have the direct support from the people on the ground. They have the direct support from the economy and the society. That means corruption is harder to detect under your paradigm, and it's harder to fire people for this. What are the outcomes? If people make biased and corrupt policies, we can't oust them, and people are more likely to support these corrupt people in board of office because we elected them anyways. The same applies to politicians in status quo. What we have is the best that we can aspire to achieve for.
Okay, thank you very much for that speech. And now to continue the proposition case, I'd like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister.
If you want the truest form of balance of power in these corporations, our side has it, because it's 50-50, there's equal representation. You hear opinions from other people who are representing the corporation. You hear opinions from people representing consumers. Mr. Speaker, unfortunately, when they consider that all these corporations are exploitative, that already proves to a certain extent that these people are more likely going to exploit its consumers. More likely, they're not going to do things in favor of its consumers as a whole. At least under our side, the people that we elect aren't the stupid people who just randomly say stuff. The people that we elect will be people who are rational enough to understand that if I force this too much on these people, I don't want this corporation to leave. So all the harms that they say is already a check and balance to make sure that these people wouldn't push on to crazy policies as a whole. I'm going to discuss one issue today. Why a world with representation in this particular board of directors is a better world as a whole. But before that, a lot of rebuttals. Firstly, they said that now when you force corporations to do things that they don't want, you reduce the quality in the products. We don't think so, because number one, people have a natural incentive, because not only do people have to cater for prices, people have the ability to cater for its quality, meaning that the people who represent you in their board of directors will also fight for the quality of the products, meaning they're more rational enough to understand what type of circumstances that happen. Inside these board directors, people don't blindly vote. They tell you what are consequences of things that happen as a whole. So when people reflect the people when people reflect the consumers as a whole, we think it's more likely that these people will also care about the quality of its products. Sit down. But also, right, then they say that corporations will make less money and then they will move away from this particular place. We think that number one, that already shows that if these corporations are that necessarily in that place, we wouldn't want them to leave, therefore we will keep them in, right? But secondly, we think that these corporations already make their base in these places, meaning that in the end, you obviously, more often than not, cost more money because you already invested so many areas in these places. You already invested in buying over this land and renting over this place. So under your side, we think it's more likely that these people will be more willing to make a compromise with these people. You arguing that corporations, your side is arguing for corporations to have a monopoly over its power and be able to choose. We think that's harmful, right? Because now, when the state is so dependent upon these people staying in your particular area, these corporations can do whatever the hell they want. Because in these developing countries, they need these corporations as a whole to stay. Because of that, we think corporations can do whatever the hell they want, and in the end, you have very little say well about it. You can fight against the consumerist society, but since you're a pawn of these corporations, the corporations can say, if you don't like it, we will leave. We think that in this certain sense, we think even if our side consumers have more power, since consumers need the corporations more, the consumers are more willing to make concessions, but at the same time, be more willing to strike a balance as to when consumers can be represented as well. Sit down. Then in his 6 minutes and 50 seconds, he tried to bring to you an argument on corruption. Look, firstly, they say that now that you're elected, you're more willing to not vote them out or things like that. We don't understand, right? Because more often than not, people also, like, if people are corrupted and are stealing in money or things like that, more often than not, I will find out about it, because their side didn't actually tell us how, because you elect someone, you suddenly won't find out about corruption as a whole. But on the outside, we think that people will still vote you out or will vote someone in that they trust more, because obviously you don't have a corrupted person dealing with your money as a whole. Because who's stopping this person from taking in their money and putting it into his own personal bank account or things like that? We think that if corruption is really a problem, more often than not, people will still keep it in. Hold on. But then they said that on the idea of balance of power, we think in the end that under your side, the symmetry of power is more towards the corporations, because there's no representation in these board directors. These board directors can do whatever the hell they want, and if they realize that if anyone fights back, we will just pull out. These corporations in these instances can do whatever they want because they know that people are pawned towards them and they wouldn't be scared to pull out as a whole. That means that under your side, the balance of power is more towards the corporations as a whole. Under our side, when we mandate a 50-50 point of representation, we think at least now you can hear the opinions in a meaningful way. Because under our side, you can have some community, society where we'll say, hey, we don't like your expensive prices. What does that mean towards these corporations as a whole? These people can say whatever the hell they want and it wouldn't affect these people's mindsets whatsoever. However, when you're in that particular board of directors room, where you know that these people, what they have, what the quality of what they say actually impacts whether we can make this policy or not, because we already mandated it, we think under our side, at least the balance of power is more equal as a whole. At least people, the things that they complain about and the things that they say actually mean something towards these corporations. Yes.
In status quo, when people vote in politicians, they are harder to oust, and people are more likely to believe their policies because we voted them in. I.e., AMLO, under your paradigm, prove to us how is it harder to oust a person voted board of director versus a company elected board of director.
Look, the thing is, the people, first of all, you elect many people. The board of directors is the 2 people and you vote 1 person in. Meaning that there are other people in that board of directors who will say that this person is corrupt, let's tell people to go against him. But we don't understand why is it harder for you to detect corruption in these particular places. Obviously, if someone's corrupt, you can find out, you can tell society, everything that because there's so many people in that particular board of directors, it's very easy to just say that this person has done corruption, this person isn't fulfilling your job, he isn't fulfilling the main reason why I elected you, and therefore we think they'll out him. Why is our better, right? On the first level, we already told you about representation. When we talk about things like whether it's oil or whether it's McDonald's or whatever, at least under our side, we mandate representation towards these particular places. Because we need to understand, and they already conceded to it, that these corporations are very profit motivated and they normally don't really care about consumers as a whole. So we think that because of that, under our side, at least now that they know that people have a presence in my particular place and can affect the decisions that I make, we have to be more compassionate and be more consumer friendly. You arguing consumer friendly is bad, it's not going to help you out, right? We think that corporations will function even better when you're consumer friendly because more and more people will opt in to buy your products as a whole. So we think it's also beneficial towards your corporation. But how about places like in developing countries where let's talk about the context in oil or things like that. More often than not, these corporations will just come into your place and take all the stuff without caring about the national people, without caring about the people. And because these places are so dependent on the corporations, they can't do anything about it, Mr. Speaker. So at least under our side, people are more represented. If you have a forest area where there's oil, at least you can say that no, we need this forest area because of our native tribes in this particular area or things like that. Second level on development, because in this particular circumstance, we need to understand that because of when these places have this type of resources and when these places have this type of talent, these MNCs, since they only filter the money back to themselves and it barely trickles down towards these people, we think that's harmful because in the end, these people need the MNCs to take care of them. They need it to be like a I scratch your back, you scratch mine thing, where in the end, they can cooperate with each other and at least share the profits or things like that. We think it's extremely important because these nations are developing as a whole. We cannot allow corporations to be able to dictate whatever these developing countries are, all because they're poor, right? At least under our side, when you can share and we can discuss in a conducive environment, at least under our side, the development can be better because money trickles down more as a whole. In the end, we think that's right. All their harms about taxes and all these things are pulling out is like, if it's true, people have the natural incentive to make sure it doesn't happen. At least under our side, there's a check and balance we are very proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that speech. Just before we go on, much as an enthusiastic crowd is always enjoyable, if you'd like to first hear your 7,000 times in that last speech, I would prefer to hear more words from the people speaking and less from the audience for the next little while. Just makes it easier for us to take notes. Okay. Cool. And without any further ado, I'd like to invite the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Yeah.
It is simple. The trade-off in this debate is about whether or not we get some benefits like jobs, like markets, but at the expense of exploitation, or we get nothing at all because corporations just don't want to be subject to your controlling environment, and corporations don't want to be subject to that world that you put them in. There are a few questions I'm going to ask side opposition before I move on to positive method. Because before that, let's look at Kishan's argument, Kishan's speech. Because there are a lot of things that Kishan said in today's debate that was not responded to, and let's revisit those items. First of all, he told you why there's a higher barrier, and especially when it comes to developing nations where states have failed to provide you with the market or even basic resources to some certain extreme circumstances. We think it's better that we reduce the barriers that come in for MNCs to come into your nation. Meaning MNCs coming into your nation is the be-all, end-all, and the last resort you have for you to have an accessible market, a cheaper alternative to products, and have sometimes basic needs in the first place. So what did he tell you? He told you that the barrier is much less disrupted under our model. We think that that's more important to happen. When they leave, and they are more likely to leave because they don't want to be subjected to your world, because if they are subjected to your world, they live in a world in which every single individual rotates and every single individual is no longer able to freely decide what policy makes the most amount of profit for my nation. I don't think the corporation will stay. And we told you a number of things, right? We told you that this disrupts jobs, especially when jobs are very scarce within this nation. This disrupts markets and multiple other things. No response from side government. We hope Kim will say something about it. But then they told us that, hey, that these individuals make it their base and they already have bases in this nation, therefore there is incentive to not change. If that argument is true, Burger King will still remain in Toronto right now. But that never happened in the first place. But second of all, they have to choose. Either they stay there, or either they leave their bases and just destroy everything and continue losing money, or they leave to another nation where they can make some profit as opposed to not getting anything at all in status quo. So we don't think it's happening in the first place. But second of all, he told you why corruption is more regulatable and it's easier to regulate. You can't just say that corruption happens all the time. We just sit down there and look at it happening in front of us. We think it happens and we stop it. That's why we have laws to prevent certain amounts of exploitation of resources. We tax companies extra when they emit too much carbon emission. These are restrictions that exist to prevent corporates from going way too out of their line. We never heard a response to that. But two questions in terms of positive rebuttal. Number one, is it beneficial under their side? Because Luke told us, look, it's simple, guys. It's maths. If I have 50% here and 50% here, that means it's fair. No, that doesn't exist right there, meaning that companies don't get to control their people now only get to control their companies, as opposed to a world in which if my product is too expensive or too less of a quality, you just don't buy my products, and it's a give and take situation. That means I have to improve my product or improve my price in order for me to get my product sold to you. That is the symmetry of power that doesn't exist under their side of the house. So we don't think that that's fair. But just because people voted something in, it doesn't mean that decision is always the best interest of people. So like we voted Najib in, and how has that been turning out first? At the point in which it does not mean that every single time a person votes something in, it is beneficial. So because they're subject to manipulation, they're subject to campaigns, and they're subject to all these kinds of things that maliciously happen in political campaigns already. That means like people who are trying to get into power will now subject to political campaigns, manipulating you, giving you stuff that you always would wanted in the first place, and never really becoming about the company and how the company can serve your people, and the company can make it much better in the first place. So we don't think that necessarily happens inside opposition. Then they told us that these individuals will easily get ousted out. We don't think so, because if it is true, it's very easy to oust out individuals who have failed the state, but they're still in power in many nations to begin with. And the reason behind this is that people believe that because I voted this person in, all your evidence supporting his corruption is flawed. All the reasons you tell me that I will not believe you because I voted this person in, this person is delivering my needs. Meaning that is harder, and that scenario is replicated to their world, in which a person is no longer able to do anything about it. So do MNCs take money in? Because they told us that MNCs are very selfish. Like obviously, if they have an incentive to stay in that country, and we will want them to stay in our country, they will have more of an incentive to build up the nation and have more development within that nation. So you can have more jobs, more markets, more of an ability to stand in that country, as opposed to a world in which they can't do anything about it. So I think they're more likely to develop their nation and have more accessible jobs because it's in the best interest of them. So they won't just take the money, run away, because if that were true, it would happen right now, but it's not. So MNCs still live in developing countries, still stay there, and still develop their nation because they have a vested interest in those parts of the world. Yes.
Can you explain to us how mandating 50% of the consumers' representatives in the board of directors suddenly make the corporation dictated by these people?
So look, we concede that there are some harms on our side. And the world in which you live in is that people vote in consumer-friendly policies. That means they will never want to cut down trees. They will never want to exploit oil. In some circumstances, we have to make hard decisions. We have to cut down trees. We have to mine and get the oil that we need. Because if we don't have a sustainable market, we don't have development, and people starve and die. the outcome of that is people will always go to the go-to response. We have to be green. We always have to protect the environment. This hampers the ability for corporations to make money, and the outcome of that is they leave. And when that happens is that people just don't get any of the benefits like accessible jobs, better markets, accessible to free products, everything. That is the outcome of that policy. But Kishan also told you, and I'm going to extend on this, is that when corporations do stay, either A, they are forced to because they just don't have any other option, or B, they control and monopolize every single circumstance in which that product needs. Then there's only one of that product, you have to buy that product because that is the only thing that exists right there. So even if it's expensive and it's horrible quality, you still have to buy that product because there's no other corporation that's challenging you in that environment, meaning that environment is crap for development. No, thank you. But why this creates an unhealthy environment for the company? First of all, in many cases, product come out at a later time. So we think in these circumstances, it's very time sensitive as well. So sit down. It's very time sensitive as well. Meaning in vast majority of circumstances, many companies that come in, many nations reduce tax tariffs, meaning reduce tax for these companies because we want them to come in as fast as possible. We want them to sell their products as fast as possible because it increases the quality of life. And that's very important towards developing countries because they otherwise would not have access to these kinds of things. This means there is a top priority to make sure these companies not only just stay, but come in faster and give everyone their products much faster. Meaning this side of the house hampers the ability for corporations to first of all just stay, but second of all, give out their products at a much faster rate. So it can also range from things like basic, normal stuff like any average day product, or even in certain circumstances where states have failed to provide basic commodities like electricity, like water and shelter and welfare, these companies come in and produce these kinds of products. Meaning it's very, very important to these nations, especially when the state has failed to ensure that these products get out in the market first. And we don't think that that'll be easier to achieve because one, they won't stay, or number two, even if they do, their products will be less quality, very expensive, and will come out at a later time. We don't want to live in that world that exists. But secondly, it becomes even worse because people resort to mudslinging. Resources will now be focused on to making political campaigns in order to ensure that I win the election and I become the person of the board of directors. Resources that could have otherwise been focused into making the product better, making the product cheaper, making the product nicer, will now be focused into manipulating individuals to vote me in. So we think there's an asymmetry of resources that could have otherwise be used to benefit the country, the company, and the product and the market that exists within those nations. That we don't think we'll make that trade-off from side opposition.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now I'd like to invite the government witness.
Where you go?
There were multiple flaws that existed on the side of opposition, something I'll highlight between two issues. First issue, let's actually analyze where MNCs actually refuse our policy or to opt into our policy because of the mechanism that we set, because that's the biggest contention that existed within their case. And under that issue, I'm going to tackle three things. Firstly, let's analyze the situation within the grounds on why they will still opt in. But secondly, let's analyze the idea of consumerism and why they disagree. But thirdly, let's analyze the idea of corruption, which somehow became a thing within today's debate. But also, secondly, I'm going to also do a comparison of benefits and harms that exist within both sides. So firstly, let's analyze why MNCs actually refuse our policy because of the mechanism that we set. Three levels for it today. Firstly, we don't think so because firstly, we told you that these are companies which generally are profit driven. But also, we don't understand the logical link that exists within their side. Just because we elect this form of individuals does not mean these are individuals that want to go against the benefits their country wants to arrive. Our side has a side also elects board of directors that also want to benefit the company as a whole. The most effective benefit that our side gives is a safety net we give to individuals, but also on a comparison, our side is the side that also wants to focus us not only on a company benefit, but also on individuals on the ground. Sit down. But also, we think it's even worse within your side, but you need to analyze, there are two things that we need to focus on. Sure, our side is a side that focuses on the board of directors, also focuses on the benefit that we give to companies, but the importance is the benefit of the people on the ground as well. If it comes to the expense that the benefit and the policy that you want to opt into comes to the expense of people on the ground, we are not willing to do so, because let's analyze how this will harm individuals on the ground. If this is the harm that will lengthen the progression of individuals, but also lengthen the progression of a country to be a developed nation, then obviously the harms of not taking that policy versus this harm is much more severe. But secondly, the biggest harm is also you bring individuals into that loophole of always wanting to make them a developing nation, where you take advantage of individuals, you take advantage of a country, and you worsen the situation there. These are harms that are irreversible, but these are harms that are also much worse in comparison to not taking the policy or not taking the case under your side as a whole. Sit down, sir. But also, right, we told you down, secondly, these are obviously a last case scenario, meaning under our case, we told you for a very fact that this policy will only become most effective when it obviously harms the country, when it obviously harms individuals on the ground. But this is severely important as a whole. Second level, let's analyze the idea of consumerism as a whole. There is no logical link within this side as a whole. The idea of consumerism, let's also analyze. These are board of directors that represent the country. Meaning, if these are board of directors, they literally tell you individuals on the ground will not buy because your high the price is too high. Then they reflect opinions on the ground, and these are obviously individuals that will literally tell you we will not buy. So even if under your side you set the thing and individuals don't buy, it just doesn't make sense within status quo. So obviously, when you have the opinions within status quo, but you also have opinions within individuals, this also benefits your company in earning more money under your side, because we give you multiple options and we also give you multiple problems on what society will buy. You can actually regulate those problems when you need to do so. Sit down, sir. But also, right, with this, it is much better within our side when we allow individuals to voice out opinions, but also we allow individuals to voice out opinions to why they will not buy a product. With this, much better if we allow these voices to be voiced out, but it also comes to the benefit of the country, but it also comes to the benefit of a company as well. But before that, yes, sir.
If board of directors reflect the people and they reflect consumer power, why not allow the people to reject your high prices instead of board of directors to reject your high prices who are prone to corruption?
Because the board of directors are individuals who have the power to do so. Even if people on the ground actually reject it, companies will not buy because individuals on the ground don't have a direct link or don't have a direct power within the country as a whole. If you already consider that these are individuals, they need to make a change within your company policy, and these are board of directors, they need to make a change, then you consider we need a necessity, but we also need a form of representation from people on the ground. Third level, right? Let's take down this idea of corruption as a whole. Look, corruption is much more likelihood under your policy because your side of the house is a board of director that only fights for one thing as a whole. Under our side, the board of directors have two folds as a whole. So a side that actually fights for people on the ground, but also a side that fights for the basis of that company as a whole. That's the idea when corruption is less likely to happen. When you have multiple individuals fighting for different forms of view, that's when less corruption is likely to happen. But also secondly, is the idea why corruption is corruption won't happen because it's a form of accountability that we hold within society. Meaning, if these are already individuals that will cause harm and corruption in your country, and they also have the accountability of doing so, that is exactly the deterrence that proves towards individuals. Therefore, corruption is not feasible. Individuals who out a person, assuming that person actually forms corruption and actually harms either form of benefit. Meaning, if you are the side that harms individuals on the ground, we will out you out. If you are the side that directly harms the interest of the company, we will also out you out, assuming you actually do so. Corruption is not a problem when you have two folds. If anything, corruption is more likely on your side. Our side is the form of check and balance, where you have two different views fighting for two different things and will out each other, assuming they actually inherently go against each other. In closing my first issue, we can directly see the individuals on the ground, but also the idea of MNCs, this policy will benefit both parties. The second issue, right? Let's analyze the comparison as a whole. Because the benefit that they only can provide is the benefit that says, look, the only benefit that we can provide is that we allow companies to say. We think on a comparison is much more harmful in terms of when companies are most effective. If these are companies that directly harm you to be able to be a functioning society, then that is not a company that will generally progress you as a whole. So sure, these are companies that will extract your resources and will give you economic benefits, but in the long term harm, they harm your progression as a country, but they also harm the idea of you being able to escalate the idea of being a developing nation. Then obviously these are already companies which are extremely harmful. The comparison of harms is extremely severe, because if your biggest harm is that we reject a decision or we reject a policy that caters to a large mass of money that will contribute to our nation, we think that is a harm that will not exist, assuming our policy is feasible in the first place. We don't think there is a harm in a lack form of representation exists in companies as a whole, because these are board of directors that will fight for the same thing. These are board of directors that will still fight for the interest of the company, because whatever the company makes also goes back to individuals on the ground, and there's a form of economy that benefit the individuals will still fight for. So thank you, sir. Considering so, we don't see there is no logical link to why board of directors that are actually elected by individuals on the ground will actually want to go against companies' interests, so on and so forth. It does not go against the interests of whatever happens on the ground. But secondly, the comparison of the second benefit is exactly what we tell you that companies are generally more willing to do so, because these are obviously the board of directors that would generally have that form of constructive discourse, if not anything else. We think these are exactly the form of benefits that we arise when companies have to realize whatever you do to a country, you must still take accountability for your actions. Meaning, if you harm the country because of the policy that you take, we think these are exact measures that we need to take to ensure that we have a safety net towards individuals. This is an inexclusive benefit they give from our side. If you do not have the board of directors being represented within that country or within that board of directors, it's exactly when there's no form of safety net towards people on the ground, but there's no form of safety net towards the impact that will happen on your country as a whole. The form of benefit is something that can only exist on our side when you ensure that you force individuals to take the responsibility, but to also ensure individuals that yes, you can enter our country and you can extract our resources, but you still owe form of accountability towards our side. We're extremely proud to propose.
Thank you very much for that speech. And now, for the last main speech of the debate, I invite the opposition whip.
People can live 4 months waiting an election, but they cannot live 4 months waiting on water, food, and oil. When you politicize the natural resources and corporations that provide the basic necessities to your people, you reduce access, but more importantly, lengthen the development that your country so importantly needs. In my speech today, I'll ask a number of questions to debunk the case of team government. The first question: why doesn't society have a right to choose? And in answering this, I'll provide a comparative. What do you have in your side? In your side, society will still and only look out for themselves. What does this mean? This means that your decision will not be based on long-term development that you wanted to champion, but short-term development. Meaning, what's the cheapest form of food and how fast get it. Therefore, this is a side that's more open to manipulation if they are desperate and only looking out for themselves. But the second thing you get in your side is you heavily politicize and clamp down on MNCs. And why is this bad? The reason why they are corporations is they have to act as corporations and carry out their business. So they are profit-oriented. But the reason why is to make sure that they have profits to give back more products to your society. When you clamp down on them, you reduce their ability to carry out the business that your people need. Therefore, they're less likely to come in this instance as well. No, thank you. But the third thing under your case is that countries cater development to a lengthy, crap process. Why is this so? Because you have to make people have less access to products. When you wait out the election for a number of months, for a number of weeks, people still don't know what to choose or don't know how to choose because they can't when it comes to instances of food and water. Therefore, you put them in a Hobson's choice where they're forced to make a decision that they definitely will probably eventually regret. But also this means that you can get less profits from corporations if you make them dependent on this process where it's long. So when there are less profits, this means less taxes, less jobs, but more importantly, less investment, because you have an iffy scenario where you don't know who's going to run the company or how they will run this company. There's no guarantee. No, thank you. What do we give you in our side on this comparative? We give autonomy to multinational corporations. For in our status quo, we have a scale of products. It will not only be the cheap products that your people will always want, it will also be the expensive products. So there's an access to all, and we also make sure quality and price is something that we can guarantee while having each other, but also more access. Why is this particularly important? More access. In your side, if everyone in the suburban area, which is the majority of the country, votes, we want more food now, this means in order to create more food in these areas, we cut off making these branches in the rural areas because we need to give more money here. If they think that making less burgers to make more stuff where they can't see is important, then we'll reduce funding to other sectors of the country where we can't manifestly see those benefits applying to us. So other minorities are going to be shut down simply because they don't have as much representation as your majority. More people will still be at a disadvantage, therefore more people still have lack of access. But you also skim on the quality of these products. If you always want poor stuff, you get rubbish products in exchange. I have 50 ringgit to make this table. I'll make it out of garbage. Therefore, your people will also live in a state where they're unhappy and they can't get the best products that they would have wanted. No, thank you. We are also more likely to come in our scenario because we diversify the market and have more of an incentive to create FDI when this country doesn't only compromise of like McDonald's. The second question I'll ask, why won't people make good decisions? Firstly, because you increase the undue influence you have on them. There's higher chances of slander here. And why is this important? Because the difference between slander in these elections and the general elections is that the outcomes apply to you directly. So these people can't simply lie about this guy giving you less water if he can. They can't lie to you about giving less food if he can. At the end of the day, people are going to get less access to these things. But companies can also now scam people in your side. Before this, they were forced to make quality products. Before this, they were forced to give back to the society. But now all they have to do is prove that they make cheaper products in order for you to buy into that. Therefore, it's easy for them to get away with giving back to society what they deserve. Your side doesn't regulate that at all. No, thank you. But the second reason why people won't make good decisions is to reduce the ability for MNCs to be diverse. The reason why we don't always fund things directly into making food is because MNCs have a unique ability of having specialization of what they do, of having an efficiency of what they do compared to public things that heavily depend on the people voting them in. Why is this bad in your side? When you reduce the ability to specialize, when you reduce the ability to be efficient, you also harm the people as well because they won't be receiving the plethora benefits they would have otherwise had compared to your side where you only focus on the immediate benefits that we can manifestly see. People can't see how it play out, and that's what you play on. Their inability or inability to decide. No, thank you. You harm yourself as well. Why will MNCs hurt the country in your side? We think you give them too much power, because now you reduce the competition of MNCs in your country. Your side has only one party who can afford to put up with your nonsense. These are parties already were invested in that. Therefore, they compromise. You said that these people will already compromise for MNCs in order to make sure they stay. Well, that's status quo. You don't change anything. So we're still going to burn our forests because people want us to stay. That's what you get in your side because people are scared. But now it's even worse because you have the support from society to burn down your forest because they voted you in. But the second reason why you have too much power is you reduce investment. It's a long process, one MNC, bad products. You lengthen development because you have less people coming into your countries to diversify your market and make sure that they can boom as well. But another reason why the MNCs will hurt country in your side is that they're more corrupt. See, people can always be. I'll take one.
All your entire speech comes down to the harms that happen when there's no check and balance. Our side gives you that check and balance where there's a board of directors who have intelligent individuals who cater for the benefit and the necessity of your community.
That's nonsense. We have checks and balances in society, right? We can always regulate the way MNCs work, and if they go too far, we fine them. We can sue them if they're harming the people directly. We also don't elect complete idiots, but here's why you make them more corrupt. People are still going to be corrupt because no one is born as such. But when your side becomes corrupt eventually, because people are going to want to grab, people are going to want to make decisions for themselves, it's hard to get them out. Because if they have the majority support and they're voted in by the public, reduce the autonomy that the company has over their employees, over their board of directors. So we are forced to keep in bad people for 4 years. This means 4 years of bad sanitation, 4 years of bad water. But the reason why you can't get them out is people simply won't report if this means we are associated the regime of one guy who messes up for the rest of the people. So you tie down good people to bad people, which makes it really bad. But finally, why when representation occurs? We think representation already occurs when there's a natural incentive to change your products based on your customer base, which companies already do. But representation doesn't always equate in fair products and fair treatment. You're only representing the one party that can afford to be the majority in these areas, therefore cutting off access to the other poor rural areas that could never afford to compete. Thank you. Let's invite the first reply speaker.
The problem with an elected board of directors that also want to benefit a corporation is that they are status quo. Side government needs to pick a side. It's either the board of directors support the people or support corporations. Because at the end of the day, under these circumstances, we cannot come to a compromise. It's either you burn down and log that forest or you don't. It's either you increase the price of a product and you don't. We think that was highly contradictory of side government to say people would compromise because we want companies to stay in our nation. Well, that is status quo. We already compromise to bad sanitation because we want them to stay say in our areas. The converse is much better, where we can keep them regulated, where we keep them at bay, and we don't force them to leave our nation. 3 questions to summarize this debate. Is there a balance of power following their policy? Secondly, what would companies do? And thirdly, why is corruption harder to regulate? A premise that side government chose to deny, which ultimately had actual consequences. First question, is there a balance of power? Side government operated on this premise that when there are 50-50 of different parties, that is when it's fair. For their information, even from my speech, I told you that board of directors are more often than not unanimous when it comes to their decision. That means they have to agree when it comes to a particular policy. That means either that individuals compromise or corporations compromise. And individuals on the ground are less likely to compromise, because that is the reason you implement this policy, meaning you have to victimize corporations or you have to victimize individuals on the ground. They choose to be convenient. They choose to say, we can do both. Well, you can't do both. It's either you do increase those prices and you make it harder for people to buy those products, or you don't and you reduce the profits of corporations. They can't have their cake and eat it too. But even if it's harder, we think that a compromise also results in a higher exploitation of your problem. Meaning when the board of directors evidently compromise towards your policy, that is when people also believe in it. Because the representative that I chose said we should lock down those forests. The representative that I chose said we should increase prices of McDonald's because it was his decision and I voted him in. People are more likely to believe policies that are elected by the people they voted in. And if these policies are harmful, it's harder to regulate because there is ground-up support from individuals on the ground. So in a converse, if companies are biased, we can regulate them. But if companies are biased, people will believe that biasness. Because I voted in that board of director, he must be making the best decision in the world, and I will support his decision regardless. Secondly, can we have quality and quantity? If that was a true decision that companies had, they would have made it a long time ago. They would have made things that are cost efficient, but also of a high quality. And the truth is, they already do it, meaning you have to sacrifice one or the other. It's either you reduce the price or you reduce the quality. At the end of the day, they chose to be convenient and ignore those facts. Because if you could do both, we would have already done it. Lastly, they said exploitation still happens. We can regulate those exploitation. You exaggerate the problems. Second issue, what do companies do? They said companies won't leave. We have proved to you systematic instances in which companies do leave. And even if companies don't leave, it's when you compromise. So when you compromise, companies continue to exploit and their harm and their premise still exists. But even if, when companies do leave, that is when the harm is worse. They choose to not engage with this. What happens when your people go jobless? What happens when your people lose the skill sets that they could have derived from working in McDonald's? What happens when there's only one company that could have absorbed all those costs and has a monopoly and an asymmetry of power within these nations? Conveniently, they forgot to respond. Third question, why is corruption harder? Mr. Speaker, we think that is pretty evident. If someone is bribed, we can identify it and we can fire them. But if you voted in that person who was bribed, when people bring in evidence against you, society just won't believe it. They will believe the same way they believe in politicians that I voted him in. This evidence doesn't exist and it's not true. No matter what decision he makes, I will support him because that is the person I voted for. So when biases does happen and corruption does happen, they are the side which makes it harder to regulate.
Very much for that speech. And now for the final speaker of their side and the debate as a whole, I would like to invite the government whip. Government reply.
You either increase prices or reduce quality. Unfortunately, under your side, the society doesn't get to choose which one they want. If we can't have our cake and eat it too, at least we can choose like which cake to eat or whatever the analogy means. But what it means, that at least society is represented, where they can say and represent the people who voted in, whether we're willing to pay more money for this nice amount of food or whether we're willing to pay less. The difference under both sides is that under our side, we have meaningful representation where people can speak out and tell people where their opinion actually matters because it will affect the decision. Under our side, you're in a meeting room with board of directors where you need to make a unanimous decision, meaning that people need to make concessions and know as a whole. So thank you, Kishan, for giving that idea to us. Because when we already said it and you exploited it even more. when you make concessions and when you make a unanimous decision, at least you can find a middle ground as to the corporation, what they want, and what the consumers want as a whole. So at least under our side, we derive that benefit. Because even if you can't have a good quality product for a cheap price, at least under our side, society can choose. At least people make concessions, and at least people can make a unanimous decision for whichever consumer product they want. Let's disregard a few things that opposition whip said, because he brought out a lot of new matter and we need to point it out. Firstly, he criticized the election process, saying that it's a long process and we are uncertain of who goes in. Secondly, he said that there's a tyranny of majority, meaning that the people you elect, you wouldn't know who it is, and if you're a minority, you wouldn't be represented. And he also said that when too many MNCs when there's very little MNCs left, that means they have a lot of power. That's new matter said, and we don't think that it's fair to do that. So let's discuss two issues. Firstly, how do we affect MNCs? They say that under our side, we will have worse quality products and we have consumer-friendly ideas, and in the end, you opt out. Firstly, that's assuming that under our side, suddenly all because consumers have 50% in the board of directors, that suddenly means that the consumers will always win, and suddenly the consumers can dictate whatever the corporation does. More often than not, because you need to make a unanimous decision, we can meet a middle ground. But here's the thing, we already told you, and this is what they didn't respond to, there is a check and balance already, because if people want good quality products, then you understand that maybe these prices have to be this high. And when people realize and they don't want these corporations to opt out, at least under our side, you're more willing to make concessions. So even if the product isn't consumer friendly, at least to a certain extent, it's more consumer friendly as compared to your side. But we don't understand, you're arguing as if consumer friendly products are a bad thing. We think it's a good thing, right? Because people can derive cheaper prices, better quality products. So in the end, when you meet a middle ground, at least the product is more consumer friendly, at least the people can get better stuff. Then they said, then we don't understand, right? Because if you already said that there's sufficient check and balances in status quo, meaning that you can find them if they abuse their power. That in itself is a real concession that these people can make mistakes, that these corporations do exploit people. And if the thing is, why would you find them? Because they might move out, right? That's basically their case. At least under our side, we recognize that if these people are actually in power, that doesn't mean we need to be their pawns. That doesn't mean that we have to listen to everything they say. At least we have a form of representation. At least under our side, and under your side, MNCs can do whatever they want, because no matter what you complain or anything, you can just threaten people saying that we're going to leave your place in a crap hole that it is. At least under our side, when you make concessions, when you discuss things, it's better. Let's talk about corruption. We think that it happens either way as a whole, but at least on our side, the people you voted in, and you vote in many people. You vote in many people as a cause to represent you. If these people are corrupt, the other people who were voted in would report you already, as that's a check and balance. Let's make it a comparative under your side, because if MNCs are corrupt, in the end you wouldn't be able to identify anyone, because no one has an incentive to identify that your MNC is corrupt whatsoever. And on the and it still never proved to us why under our side suddenly people wouldn't like. Or because you elected someone in doesn't mean you wouldn't want to get them out, or doesn't mean that you have happy with them. You talk about Najib, I'm going to vote Najib out because he's corrupt in the future. Meaning that at least under our side, you still have the power to vote them out. You still have an interest to vote someone out who's corrupt because he's not representing the main reason why you elected him in, Mr. Speaker. So under our side, at least corruption, but if corruption happens anyways, our side, at least we can regulate it, at least we can vote someone out, not like your MNCs. We're very proud to propose.
I'd like to thank everyone for that debate, and thank you all for an amazing series of debates today. If you want us all to shake hands.